This is Harsh Rules, I'm Ben Harsh, and today we're going to learn to play Paths of Glory. Paths of Glory was released in 1999 by GMT Games and designed by Ted S. Racier. This game supports 2 players and takes 8 hours to play. In this episode, we will be discussing the basics of movement and combat. Let's begin by learning how to move units on the game map. As you might remember from the first episode, movement can be conducted by playing a strategy card for its operation value. The operation value gives you activation points that are used to activate spaces to either move or attack, but not both at the same time. Activating each space costs 1 activation point per nationality occupying it. When a space is activated for movement, place a move marker on it for tracking purposes. In the following example, the allied player has played a strategy card to conduct an operation for movement and has 2 activation points to spend. To keep things simple, we have 3 spaces to consider. The top space costs 1 activation point because there's only 1 nation in the space. The middle space also costs 1 activation point. Although there are multiple units in the space, they're all of the same nationality. The bottom space, however, costs 2 activation points because there are 2 nationalities in the space. When you activate a space, you must pay for all nationalities, even if the player only wants to move 1. This means that the allied player only has a few options with this example. Option 1 is to move the units in the top and middle space, or he or she could just move units in one of these spaces. Option 2 is to move all units in the bottom space. Now that we know how to set up movement in spaces, let's look at moving the actual units. A unit's range of movement in map spaces is determined by its movement factor. This is the stat in the lower right-hand corner of the unit marker. This movement factor equates the number of movement points that units may spend in spaces on the map. Regardless of the terrain type, all spaces cost 1 movement point to enter. When moving from space to space, units must follow the path of lines on the board. However, movement may be limited by several situations. Let's walk through the most common examples. First, friendly units can move through spaces with other friendly units. However, be aware that each space has a stacking limit of 3 units. This is regardless of whether the unit is an army or corps. Therefore, if a unit ends their movement on a space that already contains 3 of these units, that space has become overstacked. A player will then need to remove units from the game to adhere to the stacking limit. Second, a unit may not enter a space that contains enemy units. Third, enemy fort spaces are a little bit more complicated. Each star-shaped fort space has a combat loss factor number associated with it. If a player's forces has at least 1 army unit and their combined combat factor equals or exceeds the fort's combat loss factor, then those units may enter the fort space and besiege it. When a fort is besieged, other units may pass through that space similar to an enemy space with an attack marker on it. We'll talk more about forts and sieges in a subsequent episode of this series. Now that we've discussed the basics of movement, let's turn our attention to combat. When a space is activated for movement, players may also take an opportunity to build a new trench or deepen an existing trench. Let's walk through this entrenchment process to get a better idea of how this works. However, before either side attempts to dig, there is a prerequisite. One player, it doesn't matter which one, must play their entrench event. Once this is done, both players can now entrench. Be aware that the entrench event can only be played once per game. Once the first player plays entrench, the second player cannot play their own strategy card for this event. And then, once entrenchment is enabled, each side conducts the following process. First, a space is activated for movement. Attempting to dig a new trench or deepening an existing trench can only be conducted by an army unit in that activated space. The army selected cannot move, they can only dig. Other units in the activation space may move freely, and after all movement for the action round is completed, then the army unit attempts to entrench. Next, the player with the army unit attempting to dig will roll a 6-sided die. If the die result is equal to or less than that unit's loss factor, then the trench is successfully dug. If not, they're unsuccessful and they can try again next time. If successful, the player can then place a new level 1 trench on the activated space, or flip the existing level 1 trench over to its level 2 side. Before I move on, let's cover off on some other notes regarding trenches. A space may never contain more than one trench marker, and the trench level may never be deeper than level 2. Trenches remain in a space until an enemy unit enters that space, even if no friendly units are in the space. When an enemy unit enters a space with a friendly level 1 trench, the trench marker is removed. If an enemy unit enters a space with a level 2 trench, then that trench is reduced to a level 1 enemy trench. Finally, regarding attrition and trenches. If a space with a level 1 trench suffers attrition, the trench marker is removed. If a level 2 suffers attrition, it is replaced with a level 1. There is an exception to this. Level 1 and level 2 trench markers in an intact fort space do not suffer attrition. Keep these rules in mind whenever dealing with trenches in gameplay. In Paths of Glory, combat is resolved in 12 steps. This may seem excessive, but many of these steps only take a few seconds to complete, and several steps may be skipped altogether based on the situation. Let's walk through a simple example and see how this model works. In our first example, a French corps and army unit will be conducting an attack against an army unit from Austria-Hungary. Let's begin with Step 1, Designate Combat. In this step, the attacking player identifies the target space of the battle and then calls out which of their adjacent units will be involved in the attack. To designate the battle space, an attack marker is placed on it. Then the attacker will call out the units they intend to join this battle. The attacking player is not required to conduct battle with all their available forces. Therefore, it's important to call out each unit. In our example here, the attacking player intends to use both their French army and French corps in the battle, and calls them out to the defending player. Next is Step 2, Determine Combat Strengths. In this step, each player will total the combat factors of their units involved in the battle. The combat factor is the number on the lower left-hand corner of the unit marker. In this example, the attacker has a French army with a combat factor of 3 and a corps with a combat factor of 1, for a total of 4. The defending player has a single Austria-Hungary army with a combat factor of 3. Steps 3 through 6 we're going to skip for this basic example. These steps often modify the basic fire column results we need for combat. Let's focus on the basics for now, and then we'll come back to them later. So next up is Step 7, Determine the Fire Column. Paths of Glory calculates combat results on 2 fire tables, a Corps Fire Table and an Army Fire Table. The Corps Fire Table is only used if an attacker or defender only has Corps units in the battle. The Army Fire Table is used if either side has only Army units in the battle or a combination of Army and Corps units on their side. In this example, both sides have an Army unit in their forces, so we will use the Army Firing Table. Next, both sides will take their combat strength number and plot it on the Army Firing Table. The attacking Allied player's French forces will use column 4 because they have a combat strength of 4. The defending Central Powers player's Austria-Hungary army will use column 3, once again because their combat strength is 3. Finally, players will reference the terrain of the target space where the battle is taking place. Specific terrain types may provide a column modifier to each side in the battle. Terrain modifiers typically benefit the defender. For example, mountain and swamp terrain in a battle space will shift the attacker one column to the left on the firing table. Desert terrain will prevent combat in that space altogether during the summer. Trenches greatly benefit defenders. A level 1 trench will move the attacker one column to the left on the firing table and move the defender one column to the right. With a level 2 trench, the attacker moves 2 columns to the left and the defender 1 column to the right. Our simplistic example does not have terrain in effect. However, keep these modifiers in mind when planning battles in spaces with defensive terrain. In Step 8, Determine Results, players roll their 6-sided die and plot the results on the firing table. For our example, let's say the Allied player controlling the French forces rolls a 1. This would result in 2 points of damage on the fire table. The Central Powers player controlling the army of Austria-Hungary rolls a 4, which results in 3 points of damage. The firing result determines the losses each side must absorb. Therefore, the attacking French forces need to absorb 3 losses from the defender's attack. The defending Austria-Hungary army must absorb 2 losses from the French attack. In Step 9, Take Losses, each player must decide how to absorb the damage inflicted by their opponent. In most battles, with the exception of those that involve a flank attack, the defender takes damage first. A unit's health is indicated by its loss factor. The loss factor is the middle number in the stats at the bottom of the unit marker. In our example, the French have inflicted 2 points of damage to the Austria-Hungary army. As you recall from earlier, army and corps units can suffer several reductions called steps before being eliminated from the game. These are the steps for the Austria-Hungary army unit in play. Therefore, these 2 points of damage would flip this unit from its full health side to its reduced health side. Next, let's resolve the damage to the French forces. When a player has multiple units in a battle, they must be sure to adhere to the following rule. Each player must fulfill as much of their loss number as possible without taking more losses than their loss number. The player may not take fewer losses than required if it is possible to take the exact loss number, but the player never takes more losses than the loss number. Since there are 3 losses to absorb, this would require the Allied player to take them from the full-strength army unit. The corps unit could not be selected for losses because even with both steps they could only absorb 2 losses, and there is an option available to absorb all 3 losses, which is the army unit. In Step 10, players will determine the winner of the battle. The winner is determined by the player that inflicted the highest loss number. A winner is also allowed to keep any played or selected combat card events. The losing player must discard all their played and selected combat card events. If both players' loss numbers are the same, then both players are considered to have lost the battle and must discard. However, there is an exception. The Allied player discards "They shall not pass" when he loses combat. If he ties or wins, the card remains face up in front of him. The card is still discarded normally at the end of the turn. Step 11 and 12 are conducted if the attacker wins the battle. In Step 11, Defender Retreat, if the attacker wins in combat and the attacking units remain at full strength, all defending units not eliminated must retreat. The defender may have the option to cancel the retreat by taking an additional step loss, essentially reducing an army or corps unit by 1 level. Step 12, Attacker Advance, follows Step 11. If the defender retreated or was completely eliminated, then the attacker has the option to advance with any remaining full strength units. And once this last step is completed, then combat is resolved. Now that we've covered the basic combat steps, let's go back and look at those steps we skipped. Most of these steps are exceptions or modifiers that need to be considered when plotting on fire tables. Let's begin by reviewing Step 4, Play Trench Negating Combat Cards. each side in the conflict has combat cards that contain text that negate the benefit of trenches. Trenches are valuable defenses that shift columns on the fire table in the defender's favor. Therefore, playing these combat cards can help the attacker gain an important advantage. Next is Step 4, Attempt Flank Attack. Normally, the attacker and defender calculate their force's combat factor and inflict their losses simultaneously in Steps 6, 7, and 8. The purpose of a flank attack is to enable the attacker to inflict their losses on the defender first. This forces the defender to calculate their combat factor only with the units that survive and may be reduced, which lowers their effectiveness on the firing table. These changes cascade through the calculation and may change the outcome of the battle. Let's look at our example from before if a flank attack was in effect. If the French attacker successfully conducts a flank attack, they inflict their losses first, and as a result, the defending Austria-Hungary army is reduced. The defender must then plot their position on the fire table using a combat factor of 1 rather than a 3. This puts them in the first column of the table. Now, let's say the die result remained the same for comparison purposes. This puts their firing result at 1 rather than 3, which means 2 less points that the attacking French need to absorb among their forces. And you need the biggest firing result to win the battle. This means a French victory rather than Austria-Hungary. Hopefully you can now see why flank attacks can be so powerful, if you can pull it off. So now, let's discuss the requirements. The attacker may attempt a flank attack if all the following conditions apply. Units are attacking from 2 or more spaces, 1 space to conduct the frontal assault and pin the defending units in the target space, and a second space to make it an actual flank attack. At least 1 army unit must also participate in the attack, and the defending space is not a swamp or a mountain, does not contain a trench marker, and is not an unoccupied fort. A quick note, now you can see why Step 3, Play Trench Negating Combat card, comes before this step. Negating a trench can open up a space to a flank attack. Therefore, if these are the conditions of the battle, the attacker may announce a flank attack. The attacker then rolls a 6-sided die to see if the flank attack is a success. If the die result is 4 or greater, the flank attack succeeds. The attacker may then calculate their firing result first. However, be aware if the die result is less than 4, the flank attack fails. When this happens, the defender gets to make their calculations first, which as you can now imagine can be pretty catastrophic. So just remember that flank attacks come with an element of risk. Finally, the number of spaces activated for a flank attack can also affect the die result. For each attacking space in a flanking position to the target space that does not have an enemy unit not involved in the battle adjacent to it, add a +1 dice roll modifier to the flank attack attempt. For example, if the French corps unit in this example had an enemy unit in a space to the south of it, it would not be eligible to add a +1 dice roll modifier to the flank attack attempt. Phew, okay, let's move on to the next step. Now it's time for Step 5, Play Combat cards. In this step, the attacker may play any number of combat card events whose conditions are met by this combat instance. In addition, the attacker may elect to use any combat card events that are in front of him whose conditions are met by this combat instance and which have not been used in previous combat during this action round. After the attacker selects and plays his combat cards, the defender can then play their combat cards using the same procedure. Combat cards often contain modifiers to the fire calculation. For example, this severe weather card can add a +2 dice roll modifier to the defender. This all leads us to Step 6, Determine Dice Roll Modifiers. In this step, both players examine all their combat cards in effect to determine the final dice roll modifier which will affect this combat instance. And that's it. You now know all 12 steps to Paths of Glory's combat system. Most of these are situational, which is why I wanted to cover the core steps in the process first. And now that we've covered off on those, it's time to wrap up the episode. In the next episode of our rules breakdown for Paths of Glory, we're going to look at the phases of gameplay. So in the interim, study up on these rules so you're ready for the next episode. If you found this video helpful, please give me a like and share with your friends. To be the first notified when the next episode of Harsh Rules becomes available, please hit the bell icon for notifications. And as always, this has been Harsh for Harsh Rules. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.